Lee had decided he was going to replace Moultrie and was going to come over the next morning to do that. But the next morning, the battle ensued, so that was impossible. Another one of these ironic things about this battle that make you wonder if it wasn't, fate-driven.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are with Norm Rickeman, author of Unsung, William Moultrie and the Battle of Sullivan's Island. Rickeman is a historian, author, and interpretive guide at Fort Moultrie outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Welcome, Norm.
Thank you, Eric. Glad to be here.
Norm, tell me a little bit about why this particular book, why this particular story. How did you decide of all the books to write, you write one about this one?
Well, when you introduced me as a historian, first of all, I want to say that's the biggest compliment you can give me related to these topics. I was had a career in business. We relocated to Sullivan's Island. My wife got sick of the winters in Minnesota. And I've always been a volunteer in a variety of facets while I was in my business career. And I've always liked history. I'm kind of a history nut. And so most of my reading was nonfiction history, Civil War to start with, but then also Revolutionary War. And so here on Sullivan's Island, we have something called Fort Moultrie. And I said, hey, if I'm going to live on Sullivan's Island, I'd like to volunteer over there, not really knowing what that meant. So I made some inquiries, went through the process and became a guide at Fort Moultrie. I had never heard of Fort Moultrie before relocating down here. I had heard of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Osceola, the Seminole war chief. Read books about them before, but had never heard about the legacy of Fort Moultrie related to the Revolutionary War, who Moultrie was and what happened here in 1776. So I found that fascinating. So the National Park Service gives me a bunch of stuff to look at. I said, well, this is interesting. And the more I read about what happened on June 28th, 1776, the more fascinated I became. But also, to be candid, the more shocked I was that this isn't a story that is more widely known, not just in South Carolina, but all over the U.S. So that's how it all started. And as I talked to people about what happened at Fort Moultrie, I spent a lot of time on that, and people's reaction is very similar to mine. How come we don't know more about this? So that is, long story. That's how the genesis for this book started. I initially asked the question, well, obviously somebody must have written about this before. So the only book I could find on the subject is Victory on Sullivan's Island by David Lee Russell. It was published in 2004. And was then out of print already. Ed Bears, the National Park historian, had written about 150 pages on it, but never for wide circulation. Other books have had it as a chapter in stories about Revolutionary War in South Carolina, but nobody, and when Charleston specifically is written about, they include the Battle of 76, but also the fall of Charleston in 1780, as if the battle in 76 is not worthy of its own treatment. So that really upset me, to be quite candid.
It's an iconic story here in South Carolina, and certainly Sergeant Jasper waving the flag on the top of the ramparts is something that's kind of put into the minds of every South Carolinian that studied history down here. Where can they find your book?
The book was released on November 12th of this year. It will be available at the Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter National Park Service visitor centers after the first of the year. It is online now on Amazon and at a bunch of other sources. So if you Google it, you'll find it. And it'll be offered by the South Carolina Historical Society soon as well. So it's basically online, and you can find it at history bookshops.
Well, it's a fantastic little book, and I enjoyed reading it, and I think it's a great tap into the history of South Carolina, and quite frankly, the history of freedom-loving people around the world. These are really unsung is the title of it, but they are unsung heroes. Moultrie was actually the commander of Francis Marion. He was the precursor to Francis Marion, and actually led armies into the upcountry to put down the Cherokee prior to the Revolutionary War. So
right.
he was thought very highly of in South Carolina. You talk in the book a little bit about he is the one who created the flag, the iconic South Carolina flag. And I've had several episodes where we talked about some of the discussions about that flag. Is it a crescent? Is it a gorget? Is it, is it just the moon? And those controversies go on even today. So, but you talked about that, and then you did a great background on Moultrie and some of the personality that he had, and how he interacted with people like Continental General Lee and then Rutledge and that sort of thing. So tell us a little bit more about the background of this book and some of the stories that go along with it.
Yeah, well, I call it an interpretive guide on the cover. So again, I'm very complimented when people call me an historian, but I see my role as really being more of a interpreter. And I have opinions in here about things that I share, especially about why this battle isn't as well known as it should be. So those are mine. So I don't reflect the National Park Service official position necessarily on those opinions. Hopefully the facts, but not the opinions. But I do think the story needs to get out in kind of it's a short book. It's an interpretive guide. Hopefully it reads more like I'm talking to you than a history book with all kinds of details and footnotes and data. That's all there. I do rely heavily on David Lee Russell's book that's now out of print, and encourage anyone who wants more of that detail to find that if you can find the book. But a little bit about the story. The story, in a nutshell, is this: 1774, 75, Continental Congresses meet. A revolution is afoot in South Carolina. They create a council on safety. They form 3 regiments of militia. The first headed by Christopher Gadsden, the second by William Moultrie, who, as you said, had experience in the Cherokee Wars in 1760 with Marion, and the third, a regiment of Rangers led by Danger Thompson, who plays a role on the island as well. And the royal governors of the Carolinas and Georgia had been really ousted from their position, so they're a little upset. So they basically plead to London, and I'm simplifying this, but basically they're saying, look, there's a lot of stuff going on over here. We've been forced onto British ships in our harbors because we've, again, been ousted from our positions. But you know what? This war is really being foisted on us down here from the north. We know these guys. These guys are our friends. They're all rich. Charleston, was by far the richest city in the colonies in 1776. Rice was huge. Slave trade. Indigo was huge. Thompson was an indigo farmer, and phosphates, minerals, very diverse economy, much wealthier city than Philadelphia, for example. So these guys are wealthy. They're doing well. They don't want to, why would they want to revolt? So what we need to do is send troops in mass, send redcoats and ships to the Southern Theater, and you'll be shocked, London, how fast this revolution will dissipate. So London heard that message and they responded. Large fleet formed outside of Ireland. The King George wanted most of the troops for this mission to be Irish, but they were to leave from Cork, Ireland, late December 1775. And the target was North Carolina, Cape Fear. There were several delays in getting it going, but they did take off in February of 1776. And Sir Peter Parker was a Commodore at the time. Later, he became an admiral of the whole fleet. He was appointed the head of the fleet. And incidentally, Lord Cornwallis was assigned to control the Army component of the fleet. So this was going to be Cornwallis's first experience in the Southern Theater. In the Americas, actually. So he was to come over with the fleet and about 1,500 redcoats to be met off the coast of North Carolina, Cape Fear, by General Clinton coming down from the north, and Clinton then would take control of the army. So Cornwallis agreed to come over with the fleet, knowing he would not be in charge of the redcoats when he got here. So Clinton was in charge of the army component, and Parker was in charge of the Navy. It was a major, major fleet. Because of the delays, they got several other ships were added to it. Interesting story is Ethan Allen from New Hampshire was a prisoner of war in London at the time, but he was sent over as part of the fleet to exchange. So they had some interesting characteristics. So obviously, word gets out that this is happening. The only defense in Charleston Harbor was Fort Johnson, where Moultrie was before the fort on Sullivan's Island was built. And that's where he designed the Moultrie flag. But they deemed Sullivan's Island, which is a barrier island at the mouth of the harbor. Johnson's Fort is pretty close to Charlestown. Sullivan's is a much better strategic position. So it was deemed they needed to add a fortress in case the British would come to South Carolina. That fort was authorized to begin in January of 1776. Moultrie was assigned to finish it in March, and it was basically built out of palmetto logs and sand, which is the only thing they had available. Again, they didn't know where the fleet was going to end up, but there was a pretty good chance that Charleston could be a target. So that was underway, and it was not finished on June 28th, which is when the British actually attacked, but we'll get to that later, but it was almost done. So the fleet takes off, goes to North Carolina. The other thing that the royal governors had told London was this. You'll be shocked at how fast the loyalists in the population and those of us that are pro-crown over here react and support this endeavor. So London authorized this expedition with the assumption that once they got here, there was going to be a lot of support from Tories and loyalists in the local populations. The Tory army did take off to meet the fleet, and they were stopped at a place called Moore's Creek Bridge, which is about 50 miles inland from Cape Fear. Major victory for the Patriots. I think the Patriots had 2 casualties. They captured 800 of the Tory force. And that basically is key because that meant that the secondary target, which was Charleston, was going to be more desirable. So the fleet off of Cape Fear had intended to land in North Carolina, come into the Southern Theater that way. They decided, no, we're going to go down to Charleston. It's a very rich city, as I said, and virtually undefended based on their view of what was happening with this, sand and log fort. So the decision was made at the end of May, 1776, that the fleet would head to Charlestown. And they arrived early June. They dropped off about 2,500 redcoats on Long Island, which today is Isle of Palms. And 9 warships crossed the Charleston Harbor Bar and got in position to attack. Several delays ensued, and finally the attack was made on June 28th. In the meantime, Moultrie was trying to finish the fort. Again, the fort was built by slave labor, enslaved people, a huge contribution to this effort. Sullivan's had been a quarantine island for the Middle Passage slave trade, so it was a key part of the wealth of the area. But we can't forget about the contributions of enslaved people to everything that happened. Oh, and Washington also has decided, we should send somebody down there to take a look. So he sent, as you mentioned, Charles Lee, a general. Lee had been considered to be the head of the Continental Army. He was a very interesting character. He's a Brit. He had left the British Army, fought for Poland for a while, then came back, then went to the New World and was kind of retired from military service, but sided with the Patriot efforts and was considered very highly of by our founding fathers and was considered to be the candidate for commander-in-chief. Thank God he wasn't, but he was considered for it. But Washington sent him down to just take a look. And the chain of command I would describe as very kind of iffy. The militias in South Carolina had been linked to the Continental Army in 75, but Moultrie himself took his orders from John Rutledge, who was a childhood friend and also was the royal colonial governor. But then, as you know, South Carolina was the first to secede from the British Empire. So before the war was even fought, South Carolina declared themselves an independent country and named John Rutledge as its president. Another thing I've learned being a new South Carolinian is how on the forefront of all of these things South Carolina is. But anyway, Moultrie basically took his orders from Rutledge. But Lee comes down, looks at what's going on, and the first impression Moultrie had of Lee was positive. He said he's worth 1,000 men based on his knowledge of how to place artillery, fortifications, etc. But that quickly changed because at this time Lee went to Rutledge and said, this guy Moultrie is a half-baked country militiaman. What he's got over there is a quote-unquote slaughter pen. It was this fort was to house 1,000 militia. Half of the back half was all swamp. At the time of the battle, there were 435 militiamen under his command, 31 cannon. Let's just say Lee was not impressed. But Rutledge didn't want to abandon Sullivan's Island because that meant Charleston would be vulnerable. And Moultrie, for whatever reason, had great confidence that he could hold that position. That's what he told Rutledge, and that's what he told Lee. So that position held firm. Lee said, well, if you're not going to evacuate, then you at least have to build a escape route. So he wanted a bridge built between Sullivan's Island and what is now Mount Pleasant. And Moultrie gave lip service to that, really wasn't into that. Basically says in his memoirs he never considered retreat as an option or defeat. The bridge that they tried to throw up was not very sustainable, so that didn't work. Long story short, the day before the battle, Lee had decided he was going to replace Moultrie and was going to come over the next morning to do that. But the next morning, the battle ensued, so that was impossible. Another one of these ironic things about this battle that make you wonder if it wasn't, fate driven. The British attack on June 28th, the most common story from the battle that is well known in South Carolina and other places too is the palmetto logs turned out to be the perfect defense mechanism because the British cannonballs would hit the palmetto logs. Botanists don't even call a palmetto a tree because it doesn't have a solid trunk. So it's like really hard bamboo, but it flexes. So the cannonballs would bounce off or embed in the walls of the fort. Any balls that went over the walls of the fort would end up in the swamp, and basically the walls held. Also, another reason for that success was the black pilots were used by the British as the only knowledgeable people for the harbor in terms of navigating the sand, etc. So they insisted they couldn't get closer than about 300 yards. The standard British offensive move would be to get your ships as close to the walls on land that you're attacking and knock them down. And they could have done that had they gotten closer. They could have done a much better job of taking out the artillery men in addition to having a better chance of knocking the walls down. But they never got close enough to do that. Long story short, after 9 hours of bombardment, the British Navy gave up and went home. The land invasion, I mentioned 2,500 redcoats on Long Island. They were to do a land invasion. It was going to be a land-sea invasion to take this little post. If you look at it this way, it was the best Army Navy in the world at the time, arguably, against 435 untested militia in a log and sand fort that wasn't even finished, led by a half-baked country militiaman who was also gout-ridden. Moultrie had gout. So on paper, it looked like a mosquito swat. If you look at some of the factors that influenced the Patriot victory, you could say British incompetence was. I said, no, it's not British incompetence. It's British overconfidence. Why wouldn't you be overconfident? But anyway, there were 2,500 redcoats on Long Island, right? They could probably have taken the fort by themselves. They were told that Breach Inlet, which is the waterway between Long Island and Sullivan's, was 1.5 feet deep at low tide. Well, at low tide, it was 7 feet deep. So they had bad intelligence. They didn't figure that out in enough time to kind of have a good alternative attack plan. So the land invasion never really took place. There was some skirmishing on that end of the island, but in effect, the land portion of the battle was not a factor. Again, as I said, after 9-10 hours, the British decided this isn't working. The Moultrie's artilleryman was Francis Marion. He calls Marion the best shot he'd ever seen. Marion and the artillery, the 31 cannons, probably only 25 aimed in the right direction, wreaked havoc on the British fleet. The slaughter pen analogy that Lee had thought of as the fort turned out to be the Bristol, which was the ship that Peter Parker was on, the 50-gun command ship. Virtually everybody on that ship was wounded or killed, including Parker himself. He had his pants blown off. A ball burst near where he was standing, and he looks down and the back of his pants are gone. So pantless Peter Parker is, again, one of these images that you can't make up. He was not seriously injured, but it was devastating. The Patriots lost 12 killed, 25 wounded during the battle. A few others died after. The British had over 200 casualties, over 100 on the ships. And one of the ships, the Action, was trying to do an end run to kind of fire on the unprotected back end of the fort. It ground with 2 other ships. It ground on the sand shoal where Fort Sumter is today. And so they got the other 2 ships off, but they set the Action on fire the next morning. And again, another one of these great images is Moultrie in his memoirs talks about looking out, watching the Action burn. And the smoke plume from that fire, he said, made the perfect shape of a palmetto tree. You can't make this stuff up. And so the rest is history. The Brits did come back in 1780. I think one of the reasons this battle doesn't get the play it deserves is because Charleston fell in 1780. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is Moultrie bought 4 years, almost 4 years, for Washington to build the army, And at the beginning of the revolution, this happened, a week before the Declaration of Independence was signed. So we didn't really know what we were fighting for. And the population of South Carolina, as you know, is very segmented. A lot of Tories, a lot of loyalists, a lot of people who just wanted to not be involved. So a lot of neutral people that said, hey, well, we don't know where this is going. This is a Rice King's problem. It's a Charleston problem. It's not our beef. Well, 4 years later, we know what we were fighting for. So I think those 3 to 4 years that Moultrie bought could be viewed as absolutely critical to the war effort in total. Had the Brits taken Charleston in 1776, they could have, I think, in my opinion, controlled the local population better. There would have been a lot of patriots, there would have been fighting, but there were a lot of Tories and loyalists, and a lot of these neutral people might have just basically sided with the perceived winner, which were going to be the Brits. So I think it's a very underrated strategic success story, not just a military one. And I compare it to Bunker Hill. We all got taught about Bunker Hill, which was technically a defeat, but a very strategic victory for the same reason. It showed that we would fight. And in this particular case, it showed that we could fight the British Navy and the Army and come out ahead, which we did. So that's basically the theme of what I wrote about. So a lot more details about the battle. But I really think it's a strategic as well as a military victory. And that strategic part, in my view, has been lost.
I think it's a fantastic book, fantastic story. You bring some authority to the subject that most of the rest of us long for and strive for. So thank you for that. The book is Unsung, William Moultrie and the Battle of Sullivan's Island by Norm Rickeman. Tell us again where we can find the book.
It'll be available. It's online now. You can Google that and find it online at multiple sources, Amazon, specifically, but others as well. And it's a very expensive $12.99. So almost anybody can afford this. And by the way, and this is going to sound corny, and I apologize for this because I know it's going to sound hokey, but I'm a Yank. Any royalties I get from this go to the Friends of Charleston National Parks, which is a not-for-profit that supports our national parks. And why it's corny is I said, a guy like me, I'm not going to benefit financially in even a small way from what these heroes did in South Carolina in 1776. So my only goal is to get the word out that this battle happened and it was a big deal and we all need to know about it. I mean, if you think about had this happened in the North, in Boston Harbor, the image of, the similar image like the palmetto plume, pantless Peter Parker. I mean, these would be legendary Americana stories, but because it happened down here, not so much. So that's been my only intent, is to get the word out. But the book will be available come to see us at Fort Moultrie. It'll be available there and other bookstores around Charleston. The
original Fort Moultrie palmetto log fortifications, are they still there?
No. Nothing physically remaining. In the when the bicentennial, when the visitor center was opened up, they did have and the fort had been redone. They did have a replica on the grounds of the palmetto log fort. Unfortunately, Hurricane Hugo in 1989 wiped that out, and they've been reluctant. The Park Service has been reluctant to redo that. Now, the city of Sullivan's Island right now is considering doing it on one of the vacant lots in the city in anticipation of the 250th anniversary. And I've been a big vocal advocate. We need to have something tangible at Fort Moultrie that we can talk from. There are some exhibits in the visitor center that are pretty good about the battle, but there's nothing on the fort premises itself. It's all the third fort there, 1809, decommissioned in 1947. Hopefully there'll be something on the island that people can get a feel for this for. It's a big gap in the interpretation value of the site at Moultrie today.
June 28th, is that a historical date at Fort Moultrie to this day? What's
Yes. Okay. Yes, it's in fact the whole state. Carolina Day,
that's
June
right.
28th, is it's where South Carolinians honor what happened way back when.
I want to ask you a question that I ask most of my guests. We have time. What does liberty mean to you?
Well, in the context of what I've just been talking about, liberty was also put on the flag, on the Moultrie flag, in the early days, either in the crescent or on the bottom as a word. But to answer your question, I think of liberty personally as the situation where I can make choices in my life that can determine my future, and I don't really have any boundaries over those choices. And so I have freedom of choice. So my life can play out based on choices that I make. And that's what I tell my kids, and that's what I tell people. Now, obviously, there are societal bounds to that. I could choose to rob a bank this afternoon. That probably wouldn't be good. So obviously, you have to make those choices within some societal boundary that reflects a collective good. And of course, from a governmental or from a other standpoint, any forces that restrict your ability to make those choices and it isn't for the collective good, that to me is the lack of liberty. And we've got plenty of examples of that. But I think of liberty as the choices you make. And I think there's a lot of personal responsibility in that as well. Make the choices, for your own life, advance the cause, but do it in a responsible way.
Outstanding. The book is Unsung, William Moultrie and the Battle of Sullivan's Island by Norm Rickeman. Go find Norm out there at the at Sullivan's Island at Fort Moultrie, just outside of Charleston. You will come away re-energized by the history of South Carolina, the history of this nation, and quite frankly, the history of freedom in the world. So thank you very much, Norm.
Yeah, and put a plug in for my colleagues, the National Park Service team at Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter, outstanding, and they all do a very exceptional job as well. And I am honored to work with them.
Very good. Thank you so much, Norm.
Thank you.